This was Tuesday's reading from week 10. The entire book of Ruth was. I'm not going to preach on the entire book of Ruth. Y'all would get mad at me if I took that much time, so I'm not doing that. And the way I organized the material, it wasn't my intention to read as lengthy of a passage as I'm going to, but I've determined that this is probably going to be the most efficient way to handle this material. So what we're going to do together, and why I want to make sure that you have your Bibles in your hand, is we're going to read the entirety of chapter 1 together before we begin to examine and talk about these things. The book of Ruth begins, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judea, and they went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that a woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest each day in your house, in the house of your husband.' And she kissed them, and they lifted their voices and wept. And they said to her, 'No, we will return with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night, and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it's exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.' Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, 'See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law.' But Ruth said, 'Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you.' And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, 'Is this Naomi?' And she said to them, 'Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?' So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest." The book of Ruth is set in the period of time when there was no king in Israel, and the judges ruled in Israel, according to the first verse of this chapter. This was an era that was marked by individualism and by anarchy for the most part. There were some short periods of time when they would turn to God and would act properly. But for the most part, it's described in the very final verse of the book of Judges this way: in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so it was kind of the Wild West in Israel. This book tells a story of devotion and faithfulness from a very unlikely source. It's concerning a Moabite widow, Ruth, who leaves her homeland to live with her Jewish mother-in-law, Naomi, in the land of Israel. It explains how Ruth, a Moabitess, came to be an ancestor of King David. He was her great-grandson, and ultimately an ancestor of Messiah himself. Chapter 4, verse 21 of the book of Ruth: Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And so she became the great-grandmother of David. And in Matthew's account of the genealogy of Jesus, it follows this same line. It says, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And of course you follow that genealogy on down to the end of the chapter, and you find Christ in that line. And so we're introduced in this book, and the reason why this book is in the Bible is to explain to us how Ruth, this person that's mentioned in the genealogy of Christ in the book of Matthew, how she got into the mix, how she entered into the Israelite people, because she was a Moabitess. She was not Israelite. This Israelite family had spent some time sojourning in Moab. And that is how she met the family. In the days of the Judges, there's this famine, and so this family of four, they leave Bethlehem. That's the city of David. It is called the city of David because it's where David was born. It was a city located about 5 miles south of Jerusalem, and it not only was the birthplace of David, but it was the birthplace, we recall, of Jesus. Moab was a country that was located due east of the Dead Sea. It was not a part of Israel, and the Moabites were not Israelites. They were the descendants of Lot. You might recall the story from Genesis 19, where God determines that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot and his wife and daughters are living in the city. And God determines that he will let them know, and he will spare them and give them the instructions to leave the city. And all of the things that happen there, you know that his wife turns back, turns into a pillar of salt, and he's left with his 2 daughters. And then, in desperation, his 2 daughters commit incest with their father and have children. And Genesis 19:36 tells us this: Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And so these people are the descendants of Lot, the nephew of Abraham. Ruth is in the lineage of that incestuous relationship between Lot and his oldest daughter. These people were sometimes enemies of Israel, and sometimes they were friendly and kind to some of the Israelites. There's just 2 examples in the book of Judges, chapter 3, starting in verse 12. The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms, and the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. And so just in this one case, we see that God uses Moab to discipline Israel. They go in, they go to war with them, they take possession of them, and they make them their servants for 18 long years. This is not a good period of time in the relations between these people and the people of Israel. Then on the other hand, we read in places like 1 Samuel chapter 22 in verse 3 that David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. This was during a period of time when David was running, he was fearful, and he asked for help from Moab, and they were very friendly to David. They were very friendly to David's family, and they took care of them. And so sometimes they were enemies of Israel, sometimes they were friendly toward people of Israel. But that's the kind of relationship that we have going on here. So this famine arises, and for whatever reason, this family decides that they need to go to Moab, that that's where they're going to be able to live. So Elimelech, the father, and Naomi, the mother, they leave, and they take their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they go into Moab to escape the famine. Now, God had some things in his law that provided for what the people should do if they were poor, if they were destitute, if there were bad circumstances that arose. I'm not sure what motivated this family to respond in the way that they responded and to go to this other place and to seek help from the Moabites. But that's what they chose to do. It's important to point that out because of Naomi's reaction in just a moment that we're going to talk about, and what she believed was taking place. As we follow on the story about verse 4, Mahlon and Chilion marry women from Moab. Now, Mahlon, we learn in chapter 4 and verse 10, married Ruth, and Chilion married Orpah. Such marriages with women from the city of Moab were inappropriate and were very problematic for the Israelites. And there's a whole lot of stuff that we could look at in connection with this, but we just want to establish the issue. And we're going to first look at Deuteronomy 23 and verse 3, where just there is this general prohibition against the Moabites being a part of the assembly of God, or the assembly of the Lord, where he says, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever." And so God had set down as part of his law that he didn't want mixing, particularly with the Moabites and the Ammonites and Israel. In 1 Kings chapter 11, we find out that Solomon, of the many wives that he took among them from both of these nations. King Solomon loved many foreign women, the text says, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them. Neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love, the text says. And so we find out here in 1 Kings 11 and verse 2 that the Lord had said to them, "Don't enter into marriage with these people." Solomon does it anyway. Nehemiah chapter 13, starting in verse 23, has something else to say about the relation between these two people. In those days, he says, "I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, 'You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves.' Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women?" And so this was a perpetual thing that they continued to understand and teach, and that's the issue among the people. But This family moves to Moab. The children are raised in Moab. The children are comfortable with the Moabites. The children fall in love with Moabite women. They get married, and they live there for 10 years. But in verse 5, we learn that the sons, after 10 years, die. And so Naomi now is not only left a widow, but she has left a childless widow. And it's kind of starting to look like Naomi is a female version of Job. She's lost all of her family. She's lost her home. She's in a strange land. She's by herself. She's destitute. We learn that because they have to eat by gleaning the fields. They were poor. And so she's kind of a female version of Job, and she takes all of this to be divine judgment against her. She is convinced that God is judging her and that God has taken away her husband and her children and put her in this situation as punishment for something. Ruth chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. Do not call me Naomi. This is when she goes back to Bethlehem. And they say, hey, are you Naomi? And she says, oh, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So she's chosen to return home. The famine was ended according to verse 6. The Lord's blessings had returned to Judah. It said that the Lord had visited Judah and provided them bread. So the famine's over. The crops are growing again. There is food to eat. She decides that she just needs to go home. Her husband and children are dead, and she just wants to go home. Her daughters-in-law, being good, loyal daughters-in-law, begin the journey with her, and she encourages them to remain in Moab. Verses 7 through 9 record these events. They were on their way, and they're leaving, and Naomi says, no, you need to go back to your mother's houses. Go back to your family homes. And then she offers a blessing on them. She asks God to treat them kindly because they had been kind to her, and more importantly, they had been kind to her children. That's what she was talking about when she said, because of your kindness to the dead. And so she beseeches God's blessing upon them that they might eventually find rest in homes with new husbands. One of the reasons why she sends them back is because she says, look, I'm not going to have any more children. I can't give you a husband. And you'll recall that the practice of the Israelites was if a woman's husband died without giving offspring, that the younger sibling would marry the wife and bear children, and the children that were born to that marriage were in the name of the deceased. She said, I can't give you any husbands. I'm not going to have any more children. Even if I get married this very night and I get to where I'm expecting immediately, by the time these children are old enough to be your husbands, you'll be old ladies. You can't possibly wait that long. So you need to go back. And Orpah is persuaded to go back, gives her mother-in-law a kiss and leaves, but Ruth insists, absolutely insists in going with her. She doesn't want Ruth to suffer because of the judgment that she feels that God has leveled against her. So she again pleads with Ruth, no, go back. And Ruth says, don't say anything more about it. And she makes the noble choice to stay with her mother-in-law and to stay with the people of God is really what's going on here. I will go where you go. I will live where you live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I will die and be buried where you die and where you're buried. Nothing but death will come between us. And she even says, may God do far worse to me if this isn't what happens. She was making a pledge. She was saying, you are family. She was saying, I want to be a part of the people of God. I want to follow the Hebrew God. And so Naomi realizes that Ruth is absolutely determined to go with her. And this is the kind of choice that makes someone a proselyte to Judaism. Listen, I know I'm leaving my family, and I know I'm leaving my land, and I know I'm leaving that false religion behind, but I am now devoted to your people and to your God. And nothing will separate me from that but death. They get back to Bethlehem. Their arrival sparks excitement in the city. They come and say, is it Naomi? She says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. What's that all about? Well, the name Naomi means pleasant. She said, don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. That's what Mara means. Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter, because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. I'm being punished by God. I left Judah with a full house. I had a husband and children. I come back empty. My husband is gone, my children are gone, and I have nothing. I left Israel with something. I come back as a poor individual with no family, and all I can do to get food is to glean the fields. I have to take handouts from people to eat. And incidentally, as you read through the whole book, you find out that it was actually Ruth who did all the work to make that possible. No longer call me Naomi, call me Mara. They settle in Bethlehem, according to verse 22. Naomi as a woman without a husband and without her sons. Ruth as a Moabitess, living now in a strange land among strange people. Their arrival, we're told, was at the beginning of the barley harvest, which sets the stage for the events in the next chapter, which we don't have time to get into. And it portends the new beginning in the lives of Naomi and Ruth that this book unfolds. This story illustrates the importance of making choices and the consequences of making choices. Choices come with those consequences. Sometimes those are good consequences, sometimes they're bad consequences. Elimelech and his sons made choices. He made the choice to leave Judah. He made the choice to go into Moab. They made the choice to marry Moabitesses. It may have appeared to be good for the circumstances. They were in the midst of a famine, and food was hard to come by, and they were going to a place apparently that was not under the famine, and they thought that they could do better business-wise, that they could provide for their family better. Maybe it made sense. But ultimately, their choices left a woman, a widow, and a motherless, or a childless mother in a foreign land by herself. Ruth made a choice. Ruth made the opposite choice. Where Elimelech and his sons made the choice to leave the people of God and to leave the land of God and to go into a foreign land, Ruth leaves this foreign land, leaves her family behind, leaves her false religion behind, and turns to the true God and turns to fellowship with his family. Your people are now my people. Your God is now my God. She left a lot behind, but her choices promised true blessings, despite the fact that persecutions may have come through them. Look at Mark chapter 10 with me for a moment, verses 29 and 30. Truly I say to you, Jesus said, there is no one who has left house, our brothers or sisters, our mother or father, our children, our lands, for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. Ultimately, Ruth portends that leaving behind her people, leaving behind her land, leaving behind that false religion, leaving those things behind and going to be with the people of God, going to follow the God of heaven, giving up all that they knew and that they had to serve God. And what happened to Ruth? Well, she becomes the great-grandmother of the king of Israel, and the line through which the Messiah is brought to man. There may have been persecutions along with the way. She may have been poor. She may have had to glean in the fields for her food for a while. But oh, God had things in store for her. He used her mightily. What an amazing thing it is to think about the fact that God demonstrates through the people involved that his intention in the Christ was always to richly bless all people. You know, Jesus wasn't purely Israelite. Rahab was in his lineage. Ruth was in his lineage. He was always Messiah for all nations. He's connected to all men. Sometimes our choices are hard and they are obscured choices. We can't see clearly what the right thing to do is. And Jesus gives us a basis for making those kinds of choices. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. That's what Ruth did. Ruth said, no, I'm not going back to my mother's house. No, I'm not going back to my family. No, I'm not going back to my gods. No, she had spent 10 years with these Israelites worshiping the God of Israel. She said, I'm staying with you. Your people have become my people. Your God has become my God. And the only thing that's going to separate me from you is death. Lifetime commitment. A true marriage to the Lord. The only thing that ends it is when you put me in the ground. And interestingly enough, Ruth even spoke about that and said, when I die, I'm going to die with you, and I'm going to be buried with you. Ruth made a noble choice to follow Naomi and to serve the Hebrew God. And it illustrates the value of Jesus' words in his teaching all those years later. I forget how many generations it is. I think it's 14 generations from David to Jesus, if memory serves me correct. And there's 3 generations from Ruth to David. So 17 generations later. Her great-grandson 15 times over is the Son of God, who came to bring true blessings, who came to bring true hope. And we see in Ruth the kind of attitude and devotion and faithfulness to God and his people that's rewarded by God. You know that every Israelite woman dreamed that she would be the one. And here is a Moabitess who's in the lineage. that brings the anointed one, the Savior, Christ the Lord, into the world. What a wonderful story. I encourage you very much, if you didn't read it last week, to read the remainder of this book and to learn the great and the wonderful, rich blessings that it holds for us. As you read this book and you don't think about some of these things, you wonder, why do we even care about this story about a Moabite woman that marries some guy that dies and then ends up being married to his distant relative? And you know why it matters? It was the providence of God and how he brought the Christ into the world. It's in the story because she's part of Jesus. And it teaches us something about becoming part of Jesus and how to become part of Jesus and the kind of devotion that we should have to make that all possible. Think about these things, and if there's things in your life that you need to change so that you can become more like Ruth, make those changes so that you can stand with her and say, your people will be my people and your God will be my God, and the only thing that will tear me away from that is when I die and leave this world.